it's just us that stands between you and lunch. But this is important. I think we had someone from the Youth Fashion Assembly who requested that this industry be given a kick in the ass. We are here to oblige. In a no-holds-barred discussion. Now, one of the things that certainly Livia and I have been working on this topic and in this sector for quite a few years, and we know many of you here have as well. And one of the things that we have become very passionate about is the need to get fresh eyes on this industry, on this sector, in order to produce the change that is constantly talked about. So our panel today is about broadening that fashion advocacy, and we have some really amazing advocates for whom this is not their day-to-day industry, who are bringing that perspective today. And we're going to start with living wage, which I think we could politely call a stubborn issue for the fashion industry. And we've talked a lot about the future today, and I think it's worth bearing in mind that by 2030, if you think about the work span, I hesitate to call it a career span for the average garment worker in the global supply chain, of which there are 60 to 75 million, 85% of those are women, they will have been long retired, and not even in a comfortable retirement sense that we might think of it. And we could be talking, if we're talking about living wage postponement till 2030, we could be talking about 2 or 3 more generations of garment workers exploited until that point. And it is very much our feeling, I'm speaking for Livia here, we should speak for herself in a second, that this just cannot be allowed to go on. So we're starting from that point today, and we are launching a report that we see as very significant. So Livia, to start with you, I think it's fair to say that some of this panel has been born out of frustration, hasn't it?
Yes, it's correct. As some of you may recall, if you were here last year, I was on this very stage and I spoke about a big elephant in the room, which is fast fashion. And that elephant is still here today. And if we had to go to yet another conference when we hear pledges, promises, targets to achieve, discussions on what it will look like, we will all become old before it actually happens. But in fact, the garment sector is the sector which has the most sustainability initiatives in progress. But is there actually one which has reached the scale that is needed to make an impact? I haven't seen it. So if successes were measured by the amount of promises that are made in these sustainability reports, well, the situation looks pretty grim. This is why I'm so excited today. First, what happened, actually, what sparked the whole thing is that recently, 800 citizens in Holland decided to sue the Dutch government because the government didn't manage to hit the targets on emissions. And I thought, wow, this is power to the citizens, but most importantly, power to the law. And when I went to Bangladesh 2 years ago, a garment worker, a union leader, she said to me, Livia, nothing will ever change unless there is a transnational agreement on wages, because the countries compete against each other. The brands are here, no one owns a factory, they don't hire the factory, so they're never culpable. And so I went back to England, and with these legal bells ringing in my ears, I'm not a lawyer, I call upon the Lawyer Circle and Jessica. The Circle is an NGO which was born out of an idea that Annie Lennox had years ago about women advocacy. And out of the Circle, in general, there is a various sector-specific circles, and the Lawyer Circle is a very important and powerful part of it. And so I asked Jessica and the lawyers in that part of as part of the Circle, what would it look like if we looked at the whole issue of a living wage through the lens, through a legal framework? And this was 2 years ago, and today, finally, that report exists. Yes, and you are all in trouble.
It's a real report. It's a real report. You'll be able to download it. It's now up, and it's called Fashion Focus, the Fundamental Right to a Living Wage. Jessica, this neatly moves on to you. So you're a human rights lawyer. When you looked at this industry through a legal lens, I'm genuinely fascinated. What were your observations?
Okay, well, just to start, I've been billed as European Court of Human Rights. I'm sorry I didn't pick that up earlier. I'm an independent barrister. I did actually work at the court in Strasbourg for a couple of years, but I'm an independent barrister. And I've worked in many areas: climate change, chemicals, internet, data protection, recycling. And when I was asked to look into this area, what struck me about it, at least in the context of wages, is how incredibly simple it was. And so I started reading all the reports, and there I found a vast, vast number of words. My office is full of documents. But these reports tended to emphasize issues like transparency, voluntary initiatives, consumer choice, and moreover involved an obsession with minutiae, so complexities like, is the living wage $10 a month or 11? What is the living wage? So they didn't really focus on solutions. And it struck me that this is obviously an area where law is crucial. After all, we had these problems in our country, and we ended them. And how did we end them? We ended them through the law. Because if one thinks about it retrospectively, and we can take the most extreme example, the slave trade. The slave trade would not have been abolished through transparency initiatives, consumer choice. This is not how it happened. And of course, it happened because we had the power at that time. But that struck me as crucial. The law is a crucial and fundamental element in this matrix.
And the law is there. It exists. It's long-standing. What I'm also curious about, has it been applied in other sectors? Or do all sectors just ignore these fundamental laws?
Well, everybody here will know how crucial and important the law is in everyday business. You'll all know that if you discuss between yourselves prices, even prices for labor in Bangladesh, for example, you will be committing a cartel offense. And indeed, the directors of the boards of your companies potentially could go to jail. But the point about all these laws is they protect the consumer here. So chemical laws, competition laws, they're all about protecting the consumer here. What about the laws protecting the people who actually make the stuff we consume?
Indeed. But before we move on to Ulla, and we only have very short time, so I hope that people will be able to read the report and also ask us any questions while we're around. But could you tell us some of the findings, the conclusions in this report? Because they're very interesting.
The key conclusion is the right to a minimum wage, which everyone has recognized for years now. The right to a minimum wage is the same thing as the right to a living wage. So you can't say, well, we can pay a minimum wage, which is insufficient to sustain a decent basic life. That is contrary to fundamental rights, and it's been accepted. That's been accepted for years. So there is a fundamental right to a living wage. Minimum wage equals living wage.
For 100 years, I think.
100 years, well,
Yes.
in the Treaty of Versailles, it was first recognized as an essential element of peace, actually. Peace and stability. So we looked at 14 of the big garment-producing countries, and we looked at the labor laws, and we looked at the minimum wages. And in every one of those countries, we found that the minimum wage did not come anywhere near, on any scale, to any living wage. And we're talking, in all cases, less than 50%. So people are being paid less than 50%, and that's the maximum, of the money needed to sustain a decent life. We then went to the CSR and transparency reports of the large garment retailers. And we found that those CSR reports claimed in their defense that they pay the minimum wage. So the conclusion that follows from that is that the large garment manufacturers setting out in their transparency reports that they pay the minimum wage are accepting that they are breaching individuals' fundamental rights every day and in breach of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights.
I told you were in trouble.
That is quite a position to be in when you hear it described thus. I'm just wondering, I'm going to wrap it up in a Bill McDonough, very positive style, and I'm going to give it as a gift to the industry, because if it was applied and through the mechanism that Jessica suggests and the conclusions that she's uncovered, we should be able to reverse a race to the bottom and turn it into a race to the top. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that, and I know there's somewhere to go, but I'm trying to be brief. Okay, and I'll stop talking in the interest of brevity as well. So, Ulla, you also have invested a lot in turning this race to the bottom into a race to the top. You've recently, I think, been in Bangladesh.
Yes.
I wonder if you could tell us some of your observations and what you think is the potential and any mechanisms that will really bring this change in which we are in dire need.
I very much hope that we can contribute to make sure that it's a race to the top and not a race to the bottom. And we have a strong focus on sustainability in our development cooperation. And we also have a very strong focus on sustainability within the garment sector in specific countries. I just recently got the chance to visit Bangladesh as well, where I visited a huge textile company, of course, and saw how they dealt with labor rights and also occupational and health and security at the workplace. And I saw childcare and health facilities that was available for the workers. And this is what we can do to make sure that there is a conducive legal framework in the country. But when it comes to the negotiation of the wage, it's up to, as I see it, the employer and the employees. And I, as government representative, especially as a foreign government representative, has to step a little bit behind. But what we're focusing at is to make sure that also within the garment sector, things that are happening is sustainable.
But presumably you would, as government, be interested in companies abiding by long-standing laws to implement living wage.
If I would, I'm not interfering into wage negotiations, and this I consider as a matter between employers and employees, and knowing that it's different from Bangladesh to my own country. But this, I would regard this as a very colonial way of working. If I was coming from rich part of the world saying to Bangladesh, you have to give this and this in wages. Whereas I would say that this is the responsibility of the sector, of the whole industry. I just earlier listened to Lisa Kingo from Global Compact. She was exactly saying that the sector is having a huge responsibility in this regard.
Yeah, because in fact, it's very interesting because when I started first approaching the issue, I learned so much from the lawyers and what they discovered and how, and this roadmap to the report being delivered. One of the things that shocked me is exactly this relationship between employer and employees. When I discovered that actually the brands, the fast fashion brands, for example, they actually don't employ the factory. And therefore, this is another, a big problem in the equation, and one reason why they're allowed to wash their hands about the living wage and spending 100 years literally discussing still what does the living wage look like.
Okay, I want to go back to Ulla and then I want to go to Jessica.
But there is a value chain for a company giving an order to, or for a fashion company in Denmark, for example, or elsewhere, asking for or placing an order in a garment factory in Bangladesh, and that's where the responsibility really is linked to the company giving the order in Bangladesh, I think.
So Jessica, is it possible to, from a legal perspective, where is the, I'm not asking you now to map out how this will be enforced, but where does the responsibility lie? And the fact that this is, if not an enshrined law, a law that we've had for 100 years about living wage?
And we're moving there. And I think companies are increasingly accepting that the UN Guiding Principles for Human Rights bind them in their conduct. And of course, I heard about how complicated and unsolvable this problem was because, you know, you're making one shirt run through one factory and other people. But ultimately, it seems to me that at least with the very large retailers, it is simply a question of choice. Because you can choose where you produce your clothes. Some of these companies are big enough to have their own factories or to control factories to ensure that wages in those factories are sufficient. So, of course, one can always fall back on complexity. I'm not saying it's totally simple, but for the large retailers, it is essentially simple and it is essentially choice. And I would say if we had an equivalent law to that relates to cartelling and consumer protection on prices in relation to wages, then immediately all of the large retailers would be paying the right wages.
You want to chip in here? No? There's the report again. Yeah. Do download it. I would love to thrash this out more and get to some sort of conclusions, but we have 6 minutes standing between us and lunch, and I feel like there would be a mutiny. And I want to just quickly at this point talk about global goals or sustainable development goals. So Ulla, could you, we're talking in this panel about broadening advocacy, using the tools that have been created by civil society globally. Could you talk to me briefly about how important you think global goals are?
Absolutely important. I mean, the Sustainable Development Goals is about partnerships. And this whole summit meeting is, I also regard this as a way of creating partnerships that that can make it possible that we can reach the Sustainable Development Goals within 2030. I mean, no sector can do this alone, no government can do this alone, so we have to make partnerships between private sector, here it's fashion and garment industry, and governments needs to be involved as well, maybe also NGOs in the specific countries, civil society. So for me, this is about creating new partnerships that will focus on what are the challenges. You have made your report that perfectly describe what is part of this big, huge challenge. And you also, as I hear you, come up with specific answers to what could be the answer to the challenge in regard to minimum wage.
Thank you. Livia, you're very enthusiastic about global goals as well. Why are they kind of important for fashion, for this sector?
Well, we did an exercise with ECO. We launched this campaign called Redress the World at the beginning of this year because we realized that every single global goal relates to what we wear every single day. So every single one of them. And then going into specific today, talking about the living wage, also the global goals, almost all of them, apart from maybe life under the oceans, relates to living wage. So you want to talk about no poverty, you want to talk about gender equality, you want to talk about responsible production, education for all. Every single one of them relates to the living wage. So the global goals are not so remote from us, are what we wear every day. So we have a huge part, no matter whether we're government, civil society, NGOs, we're ultimately citizens, and we can, by what we wear, impact on this target that, by the way, we always talk about 2030 as if it's a long way away, but it's coming soon.
Yeah.
Right?
You can applaud, yes. Yes. Okay, I want to finish. First of all, I just want to pay tribute because you're sitting here, but to Jessica Simor for this incredible piece of work, which I'm, shamelessly plugging as if it was my own book or something. It's not. So just, I'm not sure if you've already said this, so I'll just run through it again, but this report takes in evidence from 14 what we might call apparel hotspots, so the countries who rely on the ready-made garment industries. And Jessica has masterminded a huge legal team across the world, like using different law firms in those countries to collect evidence. So it's a really, really important, crucial, and I would say unique piece of work that we have here. So thank you for that again, Jessica. And Livia, I wonder if you would wrap this up, this session, by telling us what you want us to do about it.
Yes. So, some of you have seen me giving this little pin like a mad person. So hopefully not everyone is left for lunch and some of you still have it. But basically today we are encouraging everyone, first of all, go on the Circle website, which is thecircle.ngo, and read the report because it's fascinating. And you don't have to be an expert to read it. I'm not a legal expert and I hugely enjoyed it and I learned a lot. Second, on the same website of the Circle, you will find the crowdfunding page. So we're asking everyone to please contribute with $1, £1, €1, 1 French franc, anything. They don't exist.
Krona. Krona is very much
Not one.
You're not one.
Yeah. You now also know I'm completely not an expert on currency. And to please donate the next stage of the report, because the report took 2 years to compile. All the lawyers worldwide were pro bono, and now we have to start the second stage. We'll be starting negotiations with governments, with businesses, and with NGOs and civil society to implement what the report recommendations are. So with your help, we can make it. And so everyone can end up in prison eventually, which is good. And also third, last but not least, we'll post some of these pins like mad people to everyone. We'll leave it outside. Some of you have it. Put it on. Lucy, you have it. Jessica, you have it. The minister cannot have it because the government can't endorse it yet. But is basically use the pin on social media. And if you don't have the pin, still hashtag living wage human right. The hashtag will be @livingright. So please, everyone, pledge to @livingright for all the garment workers worldwide. Thank you.
Oh. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you put the pin?
It's on. Thank you to everyone here. Thank you very much to Copenhagen Fashion Summit and to Ulla, to Jessica, and to Livia.
And have a nice lunch.
Yes, have a good lunch.